Despite increased pressure for police accountability following the death of George Floyd, an NBC News analysis found federal law enforcement and local officers on federal task forces are routinely shielded from criminal prosecution after deadly shootings.
This week on Inside the Investigations, investigative reporter Avery Travis and investigative producer Dalton Huey partner with NBC News to focus on Texas, a state with the most shootings by federal officers in recent years.
And a good morning to all of you joining us here on KXAN Live. I'm Will Dupree coming to you from the KXAN Live studio. We hope you're having a good morning so far. And we're going to bring you a conversation, as we always do on Wednesday mornings, focusing on the great work that our investigative team here at KXAN is doing. So joining me, as always, is investigative reporter Kelly Wiley. Kelly, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. It's always a good way to start the day, at least for me.
No, I love starting the day this way, especially with you. We're both in our suits today,
so
very fancy.
Very professional, and we are going to have a really good conversation. The story we're focusing on is this one right here. The headline reads, "Federal agents often immune from prosecution. This Austin shooting tested this law." And the reporters who helped bring in this great story to us on KXAN and for all of you at home are investigative reporter Avery Travis and investigative producer and reporter Dalton Huey. And they are joining us again. Both of you, welcome. We appreciate you being here as well. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having us.
And this story was so well put together. So before we even jump in, I want to say our investigative photographer and our graphics artist did an amazing job bringing your reporting into fruition and visualizing it. It's really an incredible investigation to watch. But I want to also talk about another thing that's extraordinary about this piece. Normally, when we have these conversations, we're talking about work that just our investigative team has done. But in this case, you and Dalton partnered with NBC News on this investigation. How did that come together?
Yeah, Kelly, usually you're just hearing from us, and it's been Dalton and myself or someone else on the team that's been digging through data for months. This time, NBC News at the national level did a lot of the work before coming to us. What they were looking at was, they had seen, as we've seen in Austin, but across the country, just a really increased pressure from the public or from elected officials onto local police departments, pushing for more transparency, more accountability. We've seen things like pushes for the release of body cam footage when there are shooting incidents involving officers. We've seen, as you showed, so much of the conversation lately has been about that. But our partners at NBC found that necessarily wasn't the case when it involved shootings involving federal officers. So that's, agents with FBI, ATF, DEA, those types of agencies that are overseen by the DOJ. And this is important as we talk about our local story, task force officers, so local officers who serve on these federal FBI, ATF task forces. What they started to find as they were looking at these cases is they're often shrouded in secrecy. It's a lot more difficult to get details about what exactly transpired in these shootings. So they started to build a database using public records, lawsuits, even local news reporting in some cases was what they had to lean on to get those details. And so they built this database and then reached out to the states that had some of the key cases, or in our case, really jumped out to them. And so that's when Dalton began to dig into that database that NBC built.
And what did you find, Dalton?
Yeah, so it was 5 years of data, and more than 220 people who had been shot by federal agents. 151 of those died. And the data showed that rarely, if ever, do federal officers, in the event wrongdoing is present, face criminal charges. So we partnered with NBC because Texas, of those 220 shootings, Texas had the most in the country, spread out throughout the state. In the last 5 years, there was one in the immediate Austin area, but and that was in San Marcos. But in the last 5 years, there was not a shooting in Austin proper, as far as by a federal agent or a task force agent.
How interesting. So we know what the numbers show, but you guys had to find the people impacted within these numbers. You start this amazing investigation by discussing Larry Jackson Jr. How does he fit in all of this?
It's a good question, Kelly. And, you know, it's really our task as reporters is not just to bring our audience a bunch of numbers, but really the faces and the people behind those numbers. With a topic like this, you know, part of NBC's story was that these incidents are more rare, you know, for various reasons. There are less of these types of shootings. You know, Dalton mentioned there that there was one case in the Central Texas area. Taking a look at that, you know, that was this deadly shooting out of San Marcos. We're told that the Hays County District Attorney actually took that case to a grand jury, and the grand jury chose not to indict the task force agent, the officer that was involved there. And I think that's a picture and something that NBC and we want to highlight is that in the majority of these cases, the shootings were deemed justified. But what NBC really honed in on and why it was important for us to highlight specific stories and people involved is they did find that there are some legal protections and barriers in the court system that do make it difficult for local prosecutors to try to hold officers accountable, maybe in the cases that they think could have not been justified or that might need some accountability for their actions involved. And so we actually had to go outside of that 5-year database that they built. We looked back about 10 years ago, and there's a case here in Austin that we wanted to highlight because it really is one of these rare cases, and it showcases the difficulties that local prosecutors face in trying to prosecute a case like this. It's a case that many people who've been in Austin a while will definitely remember, involving APD detective at the time, Charles Kleinert, and the deadly shooting of Larry Jackson Jr. You know, this case happened years before the George Floyd case, but it did spark very similar conversations here in our community about, you know, people interacting with police's interaction with people and how that transpires.
You did mention that case of Larry Jackson Jr. there, Avery, but talk about why people might have been surprised how this all turned out.
Well, just to give you a little background on the case, you saw on the screen there a moment ago some security footage that was released in the days, weeks, months, and years as the case kind of played out. But just to give you a bit of a refresh, if you have not heard of the case involves, as you see there, a former APD detective, Charles Kleinert. He served on an FBI task force. So he was at Benchmark Bank in Central Austin that day investigating a prior bank robbery. At the time, a man we now know as Larry Jackson Jr. came to the bank, was trying to enter the bank, and according to bank employees, gave a different customer's name. So they asked the APD detective to come out and talk to him. That conversation ultimately turns into a chase. You know, court records show that Larry Jackson Jr. ran off. Kleinert followed him. There were some actions taken in the course of that chase. You know, court records say that Detective Kleinert commandeered a bystander's car to catch up. There were some tactics that were discussed in the case about how he engaged with Larry Jackson Jr. Ultimately, Larry Jackson Jr. was shot and killed. And Kleinert later testified that that was an accident. He did not intend for his gun to go off. So as this case starts to play out, you know, we talked to one of the former assistant district attorneys who prosecuted the case, and they felt that as the investigation played out, there was enough evidence to take that case to a grand jury. And I do want to note, they actually take at the time every case involving an officer-involved shooting to a grand jury. So a local grand jury looks at the case, finds enough evidence there to charge him with manslaughter. They think the case is going to continue to play out in state court, but all of a sudden it gets moved to federal court. And that took everybody by surprise. Will, your question really wanted to give you a little background there, but your question is, you know, why was that so surprising? It's rare that we see criminal cases get moved into federal court like that because these cases are rare. But there is this legal defense that exists. And it's actually rooted in the Constitution, right? It's the part of the Constitution that says that federal law is the supreme law of the land and basically trumps conflicting state law. Here's how it comes into play here. It's been interpreted over the years by the Supreme Court to protect federal police work. it's been extended to federal agents to say, hey, they are acting as an agent of the federal government. You as a local prosecutor, maybe don't have the power to override that or supersede that. So when this gets moved into federal court, that's the issue at hand. That's the issue that a federal judge here in Austin was looking at was Kleinert acting reasonably and doing what was necessary and proper as a federal agent doing federal police work. And ultimately, that's what the judge decided. He sided with Kleinert's defense and said, yes, under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, under these Supreme Court rulings, he is protected, and his work there and his actions that day were protected. I think one of the key things we highlight in the story, though, we spoke to that prosecutor who tried to bring that case to a grand jury, and he said, it felt like I think his words were a legal no man's land, because he felt that, a local grand jury wanted to see this case play out. They wanted to see this prosecuted in state court. They wanted to see it go to trial. They wouldn't have issued that indictment if they hadn't, but a federal court said there's no avenue to prosecute that here. And so that tension there is really, I think, what the NBC database highlights and what this case highlights as well.
So there's this precedent that exists in federal court about how they handle these federal officers that are facing some sort of criminal charge related to their work. But where does that leave families?
We asked the former prosecutor, who I keep referencing, do you remember that conversation with the Jackson family? And he said, it's a tough one to say, this is the state of the law. And this is what it is. The NBC story profiles a few other legal avenues that families have tried to pursue, but even those have pretty significant legal barriers that folks have to overcome to see some of that accountability. We also don't want to forget that, that the Kleinert's defense, who we spoke to as well, said there are very important reasons why these protections exist, and I think it's important to remember that balance there. But it's definitely something that more people are starting to discuss. We asked former federal judge Lee Yakel, there's been so many conversations about police accountability. Do you think that this is something that could change in the future? And he definitely said it's something that we could see. We could see some changes. We could see the court start to take up these immunity cases more and more.
Yeah, you're leading right into my next question. I'm wondering if there are any efforts to change the way this all works.
As far as any kind of conversations about that constitutional immunity, the judge laid out for us, and we think it's pretty clear in the law what would have to happen. Congress would have to, write some changes into law, and then the Supreme Court would also have to determine if any of those changes were constitutional. So it would definitely be a big process. What we have seen over the years is really pressure from both sides of the aisle, lawmakers, but also even presidents, pressure on the DOJ to make some policy changes that might make the agency more transparent, more accountable. We've seen that push for body cameras at the federal level, and we've seen that start to play out even here in Texas. We spoke with some of the FBI offices who have started to roll out those programs. We want to make sure to say the DOJ responded to NBC's request for comment by saying they know there are cases where force is going to be used. And so they've just recently, in the last couple of years, updated their policy regarding use of force. So we do see some movement here. What we did at KXAN was also reach out to all of the Texas congressional lawmakers who oversee the DOJ. They sit on that committee on the judiciary, and ask them to take a look at our story, take a look at NBC's series of stories, see what they think, see if there's anything specifically as it relates to the incidents in Texas that could be changed or that they might want to push for. We are waiting to hear back from them. I want to note we did hear back from Senator Ted Cruz, and he said he supports law enforcement and has throughout the entirety of his tenure in the Senate. But we'll continue to keep in touch with those senators and representatives on the Committee on the Judiciary as our investigation progresses and get their reaction, see if there's any movement at the lawmaker level to see what could change.
Well, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you for your reporting. I know that it sounds like solutions are on the table and that we could see more responses as to what solutions are viable now that your reporting is released. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to your next investigation. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
All right, everybody. That again is Avery Travis and Dalton Huey. I'm Will Dupree, and that is Kelly Wiley. We will see you back here next Wednesday for another edition of Inside the Investigations, where we dive deep into some of the stories that our team here has uncovered. So thank you all again for watching. We'll see you again at another time.
See ya.